The letter has been drafted 3 times, not because the words are wrong, but because finishing it would mean becoming someone you were never supposed to be, the person who changes. The commitment itself may no longer fit. The conditions that created it have shifted. The capacity that sustained it has quietly diminished. The arrangement has run past the season it was designed for, and yet the most immovable obstacle is not the practical consequence of revision. It is a sentence that arrives before any logic does. I am the one who never changes. That sentence is not a fact. It is a reputation that has learned to govern. Introduction. Every act of follow-through leaves a mark. The first time you delivered when others did not, something was recorded, not on paper but in the shared understanding of everyone who witnessed it. You showed up during the illness, absorbed the extra work, extended the arrangement without being asked, held the structure when it might have collapsed. Each repetition deepened the inscription. At some point, reliability stopped being something you did and became something you were. The distinction felt subtle enough to ignore until the moment a revision became necessary and the resistance you encountered was not external. It came from inside. Other people, meanwhile, had been reading from the same record. They stopped wondering whether you would follow through because the question had been answered so many times it no longer needed asking. Schedules were built around your presence. Plans assumed your consistency as a given. Relationships extended into territory that required you to remain the same person you had been 5 or 10 years before. None of this was necessarily malicious. Ordinary adaptation explains most of it. When something is permanently reliable, you stop maintaining a contingency for its absence. The testament bearing your name had, without ceremony, acquired a permanent seal. This book examines what that seal costs. It does not argue that reliability is a mistake. The commitment you made may have been entirely sound, the service you gave may have been genuinely valuable, and the trust people extended to you may have been honestly earned. The question is narrower and more difficult than that. Whether the form that reliability took when it was first created still corresponds to the conditions, the capacity, and the values under which you are being asked to maintain it now. The Reliability Testament is an audit, a process for distinguishing principled constancy from identity captivity, for identifying which commitments remain valid, for planning transitions that protect trust while permitting revision. It begins where every honest examination must begin. At the moment, the behavior first became the person. Chapter 1. How reliability becomes identity. There was a specific moment, not the abstract sense of yourself as someone dependable, but a concrete episode in which something was required and you provided it when the cost of doing so was real. A child needed consistent care during a period of instability. A project reached its deadline because you worked through nights that were not scheduled for working. A family crisis arrived without warning and you absorbed it without distributing the weight. A colleague's absence became your double responsibility for long enough that the original emergency gradually became the baseline. The circumstance is different for every person reading this, but the structure is the same. Something was needed, you supplied it, and the giving was genuinely difficult. That difficulty mattered. It distinguished the act from automatic compliance. Providing something under pressure, when alternatives would have been easier, carries a different moral weight than fulfilling an obligation that asked nothing of you. The person you helped experienced something specific afterward, not merely gratitude but relief. Their uncertainty shrank because your reliability answered it. That relief is not a small thing, and the action that produced it is not something this book will ask you to dismiss. A particular feeling arrived along with the relief you created. It was not pride in the simple sense of self-congratulation. It was closer to confirmation, evidence that the person you understood yourself to be corresponded to the person others could count on when it mattered. Follow-through under difficult conditions produces a quality of self-knowledge that comfortable compliance cannot replicate. You had demonstrated something about yourself that felt durable. Others registered it. The person who had depended on you told other people, or they simply changed their behavior. They stopped preparing for your absence, stopped qualifying their requests with uncertainty about whether you would deliver, stopped building redundancy against the possibility that you might fall short. Trust, extended in concrete behavioral terms, is one of the most meaningful forms of recognition available in ordinary adult life. Receiving it felt like arriving at an accurate description of yourself. Here is where the path divides. Though the division is invisible at first, there is a version of earned reliability that accumulates without obligation, where each instance of follow-through stands on its own merits, evaluated freshly each time, renewed by present choice rather than by historical precedent. And there is a different version, which is where most dependable people eventually arrive, where the accumulated record begins to feel like a contract whose terms were never explicitly negotiated, but whose violation would constitute a moral failure. The original act was a choice. The pattern built around it started becoming a duty. The repetition continued. Each instance of follow-through reinforced the record, narrowed the perceived range of acceptable responses, and added another layer to an identity that was assembling itself from the outside in. Nobody announced this transition. The shift from "you are someone who does this to you, are this kind of person," happened incrementally, inside thousands of small decisions that seemed, individually, to require no examination. That is how a virtue becomes a role, and how a role begins to require its occupant to remain the same. At some point, the description arrived in language, not from one person, and not in a single conversation. It filtered through over time, appearing in small phrases that felt like compliments and functioned as something else. "We can always count on you. You're the one person I knew would come through. I didn't even worry, because I knew you'd handle it." Each phrase was accurate at the time of its utterance. The problem was not the accuracy. The problem was the tense. Not "you came through," but "you come through." A present tense description of a permanent characteristic, stated as though it were a natural property rather than an ongoing choice. The consequence was practical before it was psychological. Because you had become reliably predictable, you became the default option. When something needed managing, the person most likely to be assigned it was not determined by freshly assessing available capacity. It was determined by consulting the established record. You had demonstrated reliability, so reliability was expected. Effort that might have gone into distributing responsibility, training alternatives, or building institutional resilience instead rested on the assumption of your continuity. The system around you became more efficient in the short term by becoming more fragile in the long one. There is an honest account of what predictability produces for the people around you. Uncertainty is genuinely costly, and a person who removes it provides real value. When colleagues know exactly who will handle a particular kind of problem, planning becomes easier. When family members know exactly who will be steady in a particular kind of crisis, anxiety diminishes. When clients know exactly what to expect, the relationship has a lower overhead. None of this is invented or exaggerated. Predictability creates real benefit for real people, and recognizing that fact matters before examining its costs. The admiration eventually merged with expectation, and the merger was quiet enough that neither party marked it as a transition. Admiration is a response to observed conduct. Expectation is a structural assumption about future conduct. They feel similar from the outside. Both are expressed in approving terms, but they operate very differently. Admiration responds to what you did. Expectation makes a claim about what you will do. The shift from one to the other requires nothing from you. It happens in the perception of the people around you, and you discover it only when you attempt to act contrary to what is expected. What made the external expectation so durable was that you had already adopted it internally. The admiration was genuinely appealing. Being consulted first, being trusted without qualification, occupying the role of the person who handles things, these experiences produced a sense of position that was not available anywhere else in the same form. The word reliable attached to your name often enough stopped being a description of conduct and started feeling like evidence that you were someone worth being. When identity and reputation converge on the same term, protecting that term begins to feel equivalent to protecting the self. Beneath the external label, something was being privately decided. The question was not yet articulated as a question. It operated instead as a governing assumption that deviation from the established pattern would disqualify the entire previous record. That changing in any meaningful way would retroactively reclassify every act of follow-through as either false or finished. The internal enforcement of the external label had begun, and its authority exceeded anything the people around you had explicitly demanded. Nobody administered the oath. No ceremony marked it, no document recorded it, no witness countersigned it. Somewhere between 100 acts of follow-through and the reputation they produced, a private promise was made to no one in particular. I will not be the one who fails people. The promise was made sincerely, from a genuine place of care, and its origin was honorable. But promises made to no one in particular have a peculiar property. They cannot be renegotiated because there is no counterparty to consult. They can only be kept or broken, which places the entire weight of revision on the category of failure. Ordinary limits began reading as character defects, arriving at the edge of available energy, discovering that a problem exceeded current knowledge, finding that two obligations required simultaneous presence in different locations. These are the common frictions of adult life, not evidence of inadequacy. But inside the private oath, each limitation was processed differently. It arrived as a possible contradiction of the established identity, a crack in the record, a point at which the internal witness might update its assessment. The response was not to acknowledge the limit and adjust accordingly. The response was to find more capacity, extend further, accept the gap as the cost of remaining who you had decided to be. Requests began to be accepted before capacity was examined. The internal sequence that in an unencumbered person might run: what are they asking? What would it require? What do I currently have available? What would need to adjust? Was abbreviated. The first question produced an answer before the remaining ones were asked. Agreement was offered in the register of identity rather than assessed in the register of present resources. To say yes was to be the person. To pause and consider was already a form of retreat. Positions once held with genuine conviction started being defended after the conviction had quietly changed. Opinions revised themselves internally, through experience, through evidence, through the ordinary recalibration that comes with additional information, while the external record remained fixed. Updating a public position requires acknowledging that the previous position was incomplete, and for someone whose reliability extended to consistency of opinion, that acknowledgement carried disproportionate cost. It was simpler to maintain the stated view or to stop discussing the topic than to allow visible revision where visible constancy had become a signature. The enforcing argument, when it arrived, sounded like integrity. Its logic ran, "I said I would do this, I have done it consistently, and the record of consistency is itself a commitment." The weight of prior conduct was treated as evidence of permanent duty rather than as evidence that the conduct had, at those specific moments, been appropriate. The previous self became an authority with jurisdiction over the present one, not through any legitimate claim to superior knowledge, but simply by virtue of having arrived first and established a pattern whose disruption now required justification. This is the point where the distinction becomes necessary. Integrity is an honest relationship between what is stated and what is done, between what is promised and what is delivered, between who you present yourself to be and who you actually are in practice. Sameness is something else, the preservation of prior conduct regardless of whether present conditions support it. These two things are easily confused because the person practicing them experiences both as a form of faithfulness. The difference lies in what each one is faithful to. Integrity is faithful to truth. Sameness is faithful to a historical record. A life built around the private oath had, by now, extended well beyond the original commitment. Other people had observed the pattern and incorporated it into their own designs. They were not passive witnesses, they were participants. Their plans, their schedules, their avoidances, and their dependencies had taken a particular shape, because your shape had remained constant long enough to be relied upon architecturally. The next question is about what that architecture looks like from the outside, and what it costs when the structure is asked to remain unchanged after the person at its center has already changed. Chapter 2. The infrastructure built around you. Every recurring problem eventually attracts a solution, and every reliable solution eventually attracts dependency. When a particular challenge appears, and the same person handles it consistently and successfully, the surrounding environment learns from that pattern. The learning is not deliberate and is rarely examined. It is the ordinary adaptation of any system seeking efficiency. Resources, attention, and planning effort migrate away from problems that appear to be solved. Over time, the knowledge required to address the recurring challenge concentrates around the person who has been addressing it. Everyone else retains only a vague and aging memory of how to proceed independently. The process is observable in almost any adult context. A professional who has managed the same client relationship for years holds an understanding of that client's expectations, history, and sensitivities that nobody else in the organization has maintained. A family member who has coordinated medical appointments, household logistics, and financial administration for a parent or partner has gradually accumulated information that exists nowhere else in an accessible form. A business owner who handles every client complaint personally has ensured that no one on the team has ever been required to develop that skill. The backup was not destroyed. It was simply never built because the need for it never appeared urgent enough to justify the effort. From a distance, the arrangement appears stable. The problem gets handled, the relationship continues, the household functions, the clients remain satisfied. Stability, however, is not the same as resilience. Stability means the current state is being maintained. Resilience means the system can absorb a change in conditions without collapsing. A system built around one person's permanent availability may display complete stability until the moment that person needs to change, and then reveal that the stability was never structural. It was personal. The distinction between exploitation and ordinary adaptation deserves attention, because conflating them leads to conclusions that the situation does not support. Most people do not deliberately arrange to make another person indispensable as a form of control. They simply stop solving problems that someone else is consistently solving. The planning effort goes elsewhere. The contingency thinking never develops because the contingency never arrives. This is not a moral verdict on the people who benefited from your reliability. It is a description of how human systems work when reliable elements are taken for granted. The diagnosis that emerges is not about blame. It is about structure. A bridge supported adequately by 4 columns functions differently from a bridge where over many years, one column has absorbed progressively more load, while the others gradually ceded their contribution. From the surface, the bridge looks the same. Traffic moves across it without incident. The overloaded column does not announce its condition. The problem is only visible in the differential, one element carrying weight that was originally designed to be distributed, and the surrounding structure having reorganized around that concentration rather than against it. The indispensability that results from this process is not purely a burden. It carries its own rewards, which is precisely why the pattern sustains itself. Being the column that cannot be moved produces something that resembles security, a guaranteed position within the system, a recognized function, a relationship to the structure that seems immune to ordinary displacement. Examining those rewards honestly is the next necessary step. Understanding the cost requires first acknowledging the benefit. What follows is not an accusation, but a description of a dynamic that operates across every context, where reliability has become a structural feature. Usefulness generates belonging in a way that purely social presence rarely does. When your presence produces something that could not have been achieved without it, your position within the group is secured by function rather than by affection alone. Function is a more stable currency than liking. It is harder to dispute, harder to withdraw arbitrarily, and it persists through periods when the relationship itself is under strain. The person who is genuinely needed occupies a position that carries its own form of security, and that security is not nothing. It is one of the more dependable ways that adults establish and maintain their place within families, institutions, and communities. Being consulted carries a similar weight. When others bring their problems, their decisions, and their uncertainties to you rather than elsewhere, something is communicated that ordinary social interaction does not provide in the same concentrated form, that your judgment, your knowledge, or your steadiness is understood to be among the most valuable available. Status in adult life is rarely announced. It is embedded in the question of who gets called first. Remaining the person who gets called first requires that the quality prompting the call continue to be evident, which means that any change undermining it must be carefully managed, or more frequently, concealed. The act of solving problems for others produces control of a particular kind, not control over people but control over outcomes. A predictable contribution means predictable results. Unpredictability, by contrast, means that the effect of your participation becomes uncertain, and uncertainty about outcomes is uncomfortable in proportion to how much it matters. Reliability, exercised over enough time, becomes a mechanism for keeping outcomes within a range that feels manageable. The world that surrounds the reliable person is, to a meaningful degree, ordered by the exercise of consistent competence. There is a question that sits underneath the continued investment in this kind of reliability, and it rarely surfaces in explicit form. If others managed without me, what would that say about me? The answer most people carry privately is uncomfortable enough that it does not often receive direct examination. The possibility that the system would adapt, that alternatives would emerge, that the gap would close without lasting damage. This possibility is experienced not as reassuring but as quietly threatening. If indispensability can be replaced, then indispensability was not what it seemed, and the security it provided was more fragile than it appeared. None of this calls for accusation. The rewards of being necessary are real rewards, sought and valued by people who are also genuinely motivated by care. The desire to be useful, to belong through contribution, to secure a position within relationships and institutions through demonstrated competence. These are not pathologies. They are comprehensible human motivations that happen to align in the reliable person with genuine service. The difficulty is not that these rewards are sought. The difficulty is that their presence makes the admission of changed capacity significantly more costly than it would otherwise be. The seal of necessity, once affixed, makes its bearer reluctant to allow conditions that would require its removal. And when capacity shifts, when the energy diminishes, when the circumstances change, when the knowledge becomes outdated or the willingness falters, the seal remains. What has changed is now hidden behind what is displayed. The testament continues to read as it always did, even as the infrastructure behind it begins straining against a reality that the document no longer accurately describes. The change in the reliable person does not usually announce itself. It accumulates quietly in the gap between what is required and what is currently available. Energy that once replenished reliably between demands now requires longer recovery. Availability that was once genuine now involves a private arithmetic that produces the same external answer through different internal means. Motivation that was once direct now passes through a layer of discipline that must be applied with increasing deliberateness. The output remains consistent. The mechanism producing it has changed. Nobody looking at the surface of the testament would know. The system continues under assumptions that have not been updated because the person at the center of the system has not communicated an update. Schedules are planned around presence that is now partial. Responsibilities are allocated based on capacity assessments that are now years old. Relationships make demands based on an understanding of available emotional resources that no longer corresponds to the current supply. The arrangements hold their old shape, pressing against a person who has quietly become a different shape, and neither side has formally acknowledged the friction. What eventually appears are the indirect signs of a system maintained past its natural revision point, decisions taken more slowly, with more visible effort. Communications that carry a faint undertone of resentment that the sender may not consciously intend and the recipient cannot precisely identify. Work that is delivered on schedule, but with a quality of completion that is technically adequate, rather than genuinely invested. Arrangements preserved through obligation rather than through the active choice that would make them sustainable. The system appears stable. What it is actually displaying is the energy required to prevent its instability from becoming visible. Concealment extends the problem. When the gap between the document and the reality remains private, the people relying on the document continue making plans that the reality can no longer support. They are making decisions based on inaccurate information, not because they are careless, but because the information they have been given has not been corrected. The longer the gap remains unacknowledged, the more elaborate the plans built on false assumptions become, and the more disruptive an honest correction will eventually need to be. A small revision communicated early becomes a large disruption communicated late. A principle follows from this: responsible renegotiation, conducted before the system shows signs of failure, causes less disruption than an unplanned revision forced by collapse. The person who communicates changed capacity, while the arrangement is still functioning, gives others the maximum time to adapt. The person who maintains the performance until the performance becomes impossible does not protect others from disruption. They concentrate disruption into a single point and remove the lead time that might have made adjustment manageable. Delayed disclosure is not a form of loyalty. It is a form of concealment with a deferred cost. The recognition this produces is not comfortable. It raises a question about what the continued maintenance of an arrangement, without honest communication about its actual condition, actually is. The word reliable carries a meaning that includes accuracy. A scale that consistently displays incorrect readings is not reliable in any meaningful sense. It is consistent. Consistency maintained through concealment of deteriorating conditions is a more complex moral problem than simple unreliability, because it borrows the trust that honest reliability would have earned without satisfying the conditions on which that trust was extended. The trust in this case is resting on a performance rather than a reality. What makes this recognition genuinely difficult is that the person performing it is not doing so from carelessness or dishonesty. The motivation is usually to protect others from uncertainty, to avoid the disruption that disclosure would cause, to maintain a reputation that has become inseparable from a sense of self. The motive is comprehensible. The effect is still a delay in the information that others need to make accurate plans. Holding these two truths simultaneously, that the motive was not malicious and that the conduct was not finally honest, is where moral reconsideration begins. That reconsideration leads to a specific question, one that the Reliability Testament is designed to help address with precision rather than with general anxiety. Does a reliable person have the right to change? Not the desire, not the preference, not the temporary impulse, but a legitimate, principled, reasoned right to revise what was promised when the conditions under which the promise was made no longer exist in their original form. Chapter 3. The right to change. Every commitment is made inside a particular set of circumstances. The circumstances are not usually listed as formal terms of the agreement. They are assumed, present in the background, as the conditions that made the promise both reasonable and possible. A professional role accepted when a company had 50 employees carries assumptions about scale, pace, and responsibility that may not survive growth to 500. A caregiving arrangement established when a parent's needs were primarily social may not have anticipated the progression to round-the-clock medical management. A business partnership formed under one economic model does not automatically survive a structural change in the market that renders that model non-viable. The commitment was not false at the time of its making. The terms simply referenced conditions that no longer exist. The first question the Reliability Testament asks of any commitment under pressure is whether the material circumstances surrounding it have changed in ways that were neither anticipated nor accommodated by the original agreement. This is not a question designed to produce a predetermined answer. Some circumstances change in ways that fall within the ordinary variation. The original agreement was expected to survive. Seasonal variation, temporary increased demand, predictable life transitions that both parties understood were coming. These changes do not constitute grounds for revision. They constitute the ordinary cost of honoring a commitment through its natural range of conditions. Material alteration is different. When the financial structure underlying an agreement has fundamentally changed, when a health condition has shifted the scope of what sustained contribution is possible, when the dependents around whom a commitment was built have moved, grown, or died, when the institutional structure within which a professional arrangement made sense has been reorganized past recognition. These are changes whose magnitude exceeds what the original commitment was designed to accommodate. Asking whether the promise would have been made under today's conditions, stated plainly, is not an exercise in rationalization. It is the same question a contract lawyer asks when determining whether changed circumstances alter the obligations of the parties. Inconvenience does not qualify as material alteration. This distinction is not peripheral. It is necessary to prevent the audit from becoming a permission structure for exiting anything that has become difficult. All meaningful commitments involve difficulty. A commitment that requires no effort or tolerance offers no real evidence of reliability. The relevant test is not whether the commitment remains easy, but whether the conditions have changed in ways that are substantive enough to alter what was actually promised. A teacher who finds the classroom more demanding after 20 years of professional growth has experienced change, but not the kind that constitutes material alteration. A teacher who acquires a health condition that makes the physical demands of the classroom genuinely unsustainable has experienced something different. Where the assessment involves formal obligations, employment contracts, financial agreements, legal responsibilities, professional licensure standards, the process of identifying what changed and what it permits must include qualified review rather than private determination. The reliability testament is a tool for clarifying what you are examining, not a replacement for the legal or professional counsel that some changes specifically require. Part of mature reliability is knowing which revisions you can evaluate independently and which require external expertise. Revision based on changed conditions is not a self-serving exercise. It is a response to facts. The person who revises a commitment because the material circumstances supporting it have demonstrably shifted is not abandoning the original intention. They are accurately reporting that the original intention was made under different assumptions than those now present. This distinction between responding to changed reality and merely seeking a more comfortable arrangement is available to anyone willing to examine it honestly. It is also available to the people affected by the change, who can assess whether the stated conditions actually changed or whether the explanation is being constructed after the desire to exit had already formed. When the external environment no longer resembles the one in which the promise was made, the original commitment cannot be evaluated as though it were still operating in its original context. Changed conditions are the most legible source of legitimate revision. Observable, often documentable, external to the person's preferences. But they are not the only legitimate source. There is a second category that is more personal and more easily misread. Some promises are made based on information that later proves incomplete. Not dishonestly, the information available at the time of the commitment was genuinely the basis for the decision, and both parties operated in good faith with what they had. A partnership built on a shared understanding of a market later reveals that the understanding was partially wrong. A caregiving commitment formed around an expected timeline extends past the anticipated endpoint because the situation was more complex than initial information suggested. A professional agreement made based on a role description turns out to describe something different from what the role actually requires in practice. The promise was not false. The intelligence on which it rested was. When new information arrives that materially changes the basis of a commitment, the question of whether revision is dishonest or honest inverts. Pretending not to know the new facts, continuing to operate as though the original information was still accurate, is the more problematic conduct. A navigator who has received updated charts but continues steering by outdated ones is not exercising faithfulness to the original plan. The destination may be the same, but the route must now account for what the new information reveals. Ignoring accurate information in order to appear consistent with a prior position does not preserve integrity. It sacrifices accuracy to the appearance of integrity. Capacity is a different category from conditions or evidence, but it follows a similar logic. Capacity changes across the course of adult life in ways that are neither failures of character nor causes for apology. Physical availability diminishes. Cognitive bandwidth, while it may deepen in some dimensions, contracts in others. Emotional resources that once replenished readily after significant demands may require longer recovery. New responsibilities created by family change, health, financial pressure, or professional development can permanently reallocate capacity that was previously available to existing commitments. These are not temporary difficulties. They are genuine, sustained changes in what a person can deliver over time. The difficulty with capacity change is the ease with which it can be confused with temporary strain. Distinguishing between the two requires evidence gathered across a sufficient time frame. A week of exhaustion during a particularly demanding period is not evidence of structural capacity change. A sustained pattern across many months, examined honestly against its context, with attention to whether recovery is actually occurring and whether the trajectory is improving or worsening, provides more reliable information. The audit should be conducted when the evidence base is adequate for the conclusion, not at the peak of a difficult period. Once the evidence of genuine capacity change is clear, the response is proportional adjustment rather than wholesale revision. Capacity that has diminished in one area may not require exiting the entire commitment. It may require redesigning the form that the commitment takes. A project that can no longer be managed at its original scope may be manageable at a reduced one. A caregiving arrangement that can no longer be sustained at its current intensity may be sustainable with additional support. A professional role that can no longer be held at the level originally agreed may be possible at a restructured level. The question is not necessarily should I stop, but what can I accurately and sustainably promise from this point forward? A map corrected after the territory is fully surveyed is more useful than one that preserves the original assumptions despite contradictory evidence from the ground. Revision in response to new evidence and real capacity change is not a departure from reliability. It is the application of the same epistemic standards to commitments that a reliable person applies to everything else. Accuracy matters more than comfort, and the information available now should govern present decisions. What remains after this correction is a further category of legitimate change, one that does not arise from external circumstances or additional information, but from the development of the person's own moral understanding. People do not arrive at their final configuration of values in early adulthood and maintain that configuration without modification for the rest of their lives. Values are not simply adopted and then preserved. They develop through experience, through consequence, through the observation of what the priorities they once held actually produced in practice. A commitment made when professional achievement was the organizing value of a life may sit in tension with the recognized importance of presence, rest, or meaningful relationship after years of evidence about what relentless achievement costs. A commitment made when service to others was understood as unconditional may require reconsideration after sustained experience reveals that unconditional service without adequate support is not sustainable. The specific examples vary, but the pattern is consistent. A value once held as primary eventually reveals something that was subordinated to it, something that, in retrospect, deserved more weight. Ambition pursued past the point where presence in close relationships was possible. Service maintained past the point where the person providing it had any meaningful capacity remaining for themselves. A public commitment to status or position held at the cost of private integrity. None of these trade-offs are invented. They are documented by every person who has lived long enough to assess the consequences of a governing priority against evidence that the evidence only time can provide. The distinction that matters is between moral maturation and impulsive preference. An impulsive preference is a feeling arising from current discomfort, directed at exiting the source of the discomfort without sustained reflection on whether the commitment is actually in conflict with a genuinely held value. Moral maturation involves the slower recognition, often resisted, often uncomfortable in its own right, that the hierarchy of values under which a commitment was made no longer accurately reflects what careful experience has revealed to be important. The difference is not always easy to determine in the moment, which is why the audit process matters. Distinguishing a feeling from a value requires time and honest examination. Moral development does not entitle a person to erase the consequences of previous choices. The years spent in a role that no longer fits were real years during which real people organized real lives around real expectations. The revision of a value does not retroactively exempt a person from the responsibilities incurred while operating under the previous hierarchy. What it does is create a legitimate basis for changing the future course, not immediately, not unilaterally, not without consideration of the effects on others, but legitimately, without being required to maintain a commitment indefinitely because it was once made sincerely. There is a version of integrity that understands the preservation of every prior commitment as the highest expression of moral seriousness. From within this framework, revising a commitment on the basis of changed values looks like a euphemism for selfishness, a way of dressing up the desire for a more comfortable arrangement in the language of personal growth. This critique deserves a serious response rather than dismissal. The answer is that integrity is not simply persistence, it is honest alignment between stated commitments and actual capacity, conditions, and values, an alignment that, when conditions have materially shifted, may require revision to restore rather than to abandon. Must integrity preserve every old priority after careful experience has revealed a more complete moral framework? The answer the reliability testament supplies is no, with conditions. Changed values justify revision when the change is substantive rather than opportunistic, when the effects on others have been honestly assessed, when responsibility for previous choices is preserved rather than disclaimed, and when the revision is pursued through a responsible process rather than through abrupt withdrawal. These conditions matter. They distinguish the maturation of values from their mere rationalization, and they distinguish revision from abandonment. With the three categories of legitimate revision now defined, changed conditions, changed evidence and capacity, changed values, a practical question becomes available. What specific kinds of change does the reliable person's identity most consistently block? The answer is not general. There are distinct categories, and each requires a different form of attention. Chapter 4. 4 Changes. The reliable person resists. The opinion was stated clearly. It may have been stated in writing, in a meeting, in a public conversation, or in a formal context that gave it weight beyond its immediate moment. At the time, the position reflected the best available reasoning and the evidence at hand. Subsequently, additional information arrived. A development, a study of outcomes, a perspective not previously considered, practical experience with the consequences of the original position. And the reasoning that produced the original conclusion no longer holds in its original form. The conclusion should be updated. The obstacle is that updating it requires announcing, to the same audience that witnessed the original statement, that the original statement was incomplete. The fear this produces is specific, not simply the discomfort of being seen to have been wrong, but the threat of appearing inconsistent, of providing evidence that the reliable record contains errors. For the person whose reputation rests substantially on constancy, even intellectual constancy, a visible revision reads as a crack in the foundation. The reliable person said this. Now they are saying something different. If they could change this, what else might change? The fear is not proportional to the significance of the specific opinion. It is proportional to the identity weight that the reputation for consistency carries. The distinction that resolves this is between contradiction and updating. Contradiction is asserting one thing while simultaneously asserting its opposite, with no acknowledgement of the conflict and no account of what changed. Updating is identifying what new information or reasoning produced a revised conclusion, explaining the revision transparently, and acknowledging what was incomplete or incorrect in the previous position. Contradiction is intellectually incoherent. Updating is the behavior of a person who takes the original claim seriously enough to revise it when the evidence requires. A credible intellectual record is not one that never changes. It is one whose changes can be traced to honest reasons. What the updated position requires is not elaborate apology, but clear explanation. The new evidence should be named specifically. The conclusion it produces should be stated directly. The consequences of the prior position, if they were real and affected real people, should be acknowledged without dramatizing them beyond their actual weight. The revision, communicated clearly and grounded in stated reasoning, does more to demonstrate reliability than the defense of a position that the evidence no longer supports. The person who maintains an outdated position to appear consistent is actually choosing appearance over accuracy, which is, examined honestly, a compromise of the thing they are trying to protect. Acknowledging the prior position honestly also means accepting the possibility that some people preferred the original conclusion and will receive the update poorly. Not every audience finds intellectual revision reassuring, particularly when the original position served their interests. This response is worth hearing, worth assessing for whether it contains valid information about the revision, and ultimately worth tolerating when the revision reflects an honest reading of changed evidence. The practice of changing positions under social pressure, revising not because the evidence changed but because the audience disliked the assessment, is genuinely unreliable. That is not what revision in response to evidence means. Concealing an updated conclusion to protect the appearance of consistency has a particular cost. It requires active maintenance. The person managing the gap between their current understanding and their stated position must track where the gap applies. Avoid conversations that might expose it, and construct explanations that technically do not contradict the original position while not fully committing to it. This is not a stable situation. It grows more demanding as the gap widens, and it positions future revelation as a greater breach than immediate correction would have been. The amendment attached to the testament, clearly marked, dated, explaining the basis for revision, is not a stain on the document. It is evidence that the document is maintained honestly. The testament with visible, reasoned amendments is more trustworthy, not less, than one that displays no evidence of ever having been examined. Intellectual reliability is not the permanent defense of original conclusions. It is the honest management of what is currently known. The previous availability was real. The previous workload was not maintained through some property unique to a past version of the person. It was maintained through genuine effort that was, at the time, sustainable. What has changed is not the willingness, the care, or the character. What has changed is the arithmetic of available hours, energy, attention, or emotional resource. New responsibilities have accumulated on top of the original commitments. Health has shifted the cost of sustained exertion. Other relationships now require genuine presence rather than the residual attention they once received. The original workload remains on the schedule, but the conditions supporting it no longer resemble those under which it was assembled. Evidence of genuine capacity change should be gathered over time, not assessed at the peak of a difficult week. A sustained pattern, months rather than days, in which available capacity consistently falls short of what the commitment requires, in which recovery from the demands of the arrangement is incomplete rather than adequate, in which the quality of performance is maintained only by drawing resources away from other genuine obligations, provides the basis for a meaningful assessment. Temporary strain during a high-demand period is not the same as a structural change in what a person can deliver. The difference between them is important because the responses they justify are different. Once the evidence is clear, the categories of relevant duty should be separated. Essential duties, those with direct dependence, with safety implications, with formal obligation, receive priority in whatever capacity remains available. These are not optional items to be reduced first. The capacity adjustment, where it must occur, begins with the less essential. The extended availability that went beyond the core obligation, the informal commitments accepted in addition to formal ones, the residual services provided as a matter of habit or courtesy rather than genuine promise. Essential functions are identified and protected before anything else is changed. The form a reduction takes matters as much as the fact of the reduction. Some commitments can be redesigned, the scope adjusted, the timeline extended, the delivery method changed, without requiring the commitment itself to end. Sharing specific responsibilities with others who have capacity for them is different from abandoning the domain entirely. Where a person has been the sole holder of specific knowledge or relationships, transferring that knowledge and those connections is part of the responsible transition rather than an aftermath of it. The reduction should produce a commitment that is honest about its current scope, rather than a commitment whose scope remains inflated on paper. Notice is not optional. When a capacity change will affect others in practical ways, they require sufficient time to adjust their own arrangements. The length of appropriate notice is proportional to the degree of disruption. A minor reduction in availability may require a brief acknowledgement, while a significant withdrawal from an essential function requires a transition period of corresponding length. Notice is not the same as requesting approval. The decision about whether to change is separate from the communication of what is changing and when. Approval may or may not be forthcoming. Notice is owed regardless. The capacity change most reliably, blocked by the identity of the reliable person, is not the dramatic withdrawal but the incremental reduction. Stepping back entirely from a role is visible enough to prompt a formal conversation. Reducing marginally, giving slightly less, responding slightly more slowly, investing slightly less effort, is easily maintained invisibly and, for that reason, easily allowed to drift into a sustained pattern of understated performance. The Reliability Testament treats early, explicit communication of reduced capacity as a form of reliability rather than a departure from it. The person who communicates a reduction before it affects output is more trustworthy than the person who conceals the reduction until it becomes a pattern requiring retrospective explanation. Career, caregiving, business leadership, professional practice, community position, the roles that define adult life in its most visible form were mostly acquired at a point when the person's understanding of themselves, their values, their capacity, and their available options was different from its current state. A leadership role accepted because it provided a necessary kind of recognition may no longer provide what it once did. A business built around a service that the founder no longer finds sustaining may have grown in directions that would require a different person to continue managing them well. A caregiving role taken on because it was genuinely needed may have been held past the point where it can be sustained without significant cost to other genuine obligations. The role was appropriate when it was assumed. Evidence of a changed fit is not evidence that accepting it was a mistake. Life roles require what the person had at the time of acceptance, not what they would have had if they had lived differently before the role began. Present evidence of misalignment, recurring resistance to the demands of the role, the regular use of will to perform functions that once produced engagement, the sense that the role requires the person to pretend to be someone they are no longer, is information about the present, not a verdict on the past. Others have organized around the role's continuity, and this creates a genuine complication. Succession, in any meaningful context, is not a neutral event. People who relied on a particular person in a particular role must adapt to someone different, and the adaptation takes time and involves loss. This consequence is real and should be weighed honestly. It does not, however, constitute a permanent prohibition. The question is not whether anyone will be disrupted. Role transitions always disrupt, but whether the transition can be designed and managed in a way that keeps the disruption within reasonable bounds and protects the people most genuinely dependent on continuity. The categories relevant to role change are distinct and require different approaches. Redesign involves remaining within the role, but restructuring its demands, scope, or operating conditions to produce a better fit with present reality. Succession involves identifying, preparing, and transitioning responsibility to another person capable of fulfilling the role's genuine requirements. Departure involves a clean, planned, and communicated end to the role, with appropriate provision for what happens next. These three responses are not interchangeable, and choosing among them requires an honest assessment of whether the role itself can be changed, whether another person is equipped to hold it, or whether ending is the only path that accurately corresponds to present conditions. Planning the effect on stakeholders is the work that converts a private decision into a responsible one. Identifying who specifically depends on the role, what they require during transition, what information must be transferred, what support structures must be established before withdrawal becomes complete. This is the substance of responsible role change. It is not primarily about protecting the person making the change from criticism. It is about acknowledging that roles in adult life are embedded in systems of mutual dependency, and that the departure of a person from a role they have held for years leaves a specific shape of absence that requires specific preparation. The public story will change. A nameplate removed is not destroyed, it is archived. The years of service in a role are not retroactively erased by the decision to leave it, but the narrative that others tell about who you are, what you represent, and what can be counted on from you will be updated by the departure, and some of those narratives will not be flattering. Accepting this is part of the genuine cost of role change, and it is a cost that cannot be managed away through sufficiently careful communication. Some people will feel that the departure contradicts the identity they had attributed to you, and they will say so. The question is whether the identity they attributed was accurate, and whether its continued accuracy is worth the cost of maintaining it. What prevents these three forms of change, revised opinions, adjusted capacity, and changed roles, from being pursued when the evidence supports them is not simply social pressure or external resistance. The mechanisms are more precisely locatable, and understanding them makes the trap navigable rather than merely visible. Chapter 5. The reliability trap. The specific commitment is narrowly defined: a reduced caregiving schedule, a contracted client relationship, a restructured professional obligation, a changed personal arrangement. The revision has been evaluated, the basis is legitimate, the affected parties have been identified. And yet, at the point of communicating the change, something much larger enters the picture. The imagination does not show the adjustment being received as local and specific, a single modification to a single commitment. It shows the entire record being reopened for review. Every promise ever kept is now read against this one instance of revision, and the accumulated evidence of decades seems to be at risk of being reclassified. This is the global reputation fear, and its proportions exceed any realistic account of how most people process a single change from someone with a long record of reliability. The mechanism that produces it is a conflation of local revision with global character. The reasoning stated plainly runs, if I change this, they will question everything. The implicit premise that reliability requires unbroken consistency across every commitment in perpetuity is not one most people would endorse if it were stated explicitly. But it operates powerfully in the imagination of the person whose identity rests on the reputation being protected. Actual stakeholder reactions, examined with some precision, are usually more specific and less catastrophic than the anticipated global renegotiation. A client affected by a revised arrangement is primarily concerned with the specific arrangement, whether the change is manageable, what it means for their own plans, and what alternatives exist. A family member inconvenienced by a changed schedule is primarily navigating the specific inconvenience. The leap to therefore this person was never reliable requires a particular kind of reasoning that most people in functional relationships do not make automatically. They make it when they feel the change was careless, unexplained, sudden, or unsupported by a transition, which is to say, when the revision was handled poorly, not merely because revision occurred. The realistic population of people who require reassurance is usually smaller than the imagined audience of the global verdict. Identifying specifically who is affected, what they actually need to know, and what form of communication would address their legitimate concerns reduces the scope of the conversation to its actual dimensions. Some people will need practical information about what changes and what continues. Some will need acknowledgement of the disruption the change creates. Some will need a realistic transition plan. Very few will require a comprehensive defense of the entire prior record. Reputation management and factual communication are different activities, and conflating them produces a kind of dishonesty. Factual communication states what is changing, why it is changing, what remains in place, and what the transition plan includes. Reputation management is primarily concerned with how the change will be perceived and works to shape that perception. The reliable person needs the first. The trap being described is one in which the anxiety about the second prevents the first from occurring, where the fear of reputational damage produces concealment of changes that are actually occurring, which creates greater reputational damage when the concealment is eventually discovered. Overpromising, maintained as a strategy for managing reputation, ultimately produces more reputational risk than honest adjustment would have. A person who agrees to everything and cannot deliver everything is creating a pattern that erodes trust from the inside. A person who agrees to specific things and delivers them accurately is building a more durable reputation on a smaller promise, one that survives because it is not dependent on maintaining a historical level of commitment that the present person cannot sustain. The testament with an accurate entry is more trustworthy than one whose entries describe a person who no longer exists. The global reputation fear is closely related to a second mechanism, which operates not through the imagined reaction of others, but through the authority of the original moment of commitment itself. Return to the moment the promise was made. The context was specific. A particular relationship at a particular stage, a professional arrangement during a particular phase of a career, a personal commitment made during a particular season of life with particular resources and a particular understanding of what the commitment would require. That version of the moment carried genuine weight. The words were chosen seriously. The intention was real. The record of that moment is not in dispute. Embedded in the original promise were assumptions that were never stated, because they were understood to be the context rather than the content. The commitment assumed certain conditions would continue. It assumed that the capacity available at the moment of agreement would remain available. It assumed that the needs it was designed to meet would continue in roughly the same form. These assumptions were not dishonest. They were implicit in the act of making a promise, which necessarily addresses the foreseeable future rather than every possible future. The problem is that they were never made explicit, which means they were also never reviewed. What was not anticipated at the moment of agreement is now the operating environment. This gap between the original assumptions and the current conditions is where revision finds its legitimate basis, but it is also where a particular psychological dynamic takes hold. The person who made the promise tends to grant that prior self a moral authority that the present self cannot easily override. The earlier commitment is treated as a command issued by someone with full understanding and complete intention, someone who meant it and should therefore be honored. The present person, with their changed conditions and new evidence, is experienced as weaker or more compromised than that earlier version, which means that revising the promise feels like the weaker self overriding the stronger one. Responsibility for careless promises is real and should not be disclaimed through the audit process. Their commitment made impulsively, under pressure without genuine assessment of capacity or consequences, created obligations that should not be silently revised as though the original was never meant seriously. Where a promise was careless, the repair owed to those affected is proportional to the carelessness and its downstream effects. This is not an optional acknowledgement. It is part of what distinguishes principled revision from opportunistic exit. Where conditions have materially changed, however, the original wording should be understood as a document referencing those conditions rather than as a command valid in perpetuity regardless of context. Legal instruments are routinely drafted with amendment clauses, not because the parties expect to abandon their obligations, but because they recognize that circumstances may change in ways that require the terms to be adjusted while the underlying relationship and intention continue. The absence of a formal amendment clause from a personal commitment does not mean amendment is impossible. It means the amendment process must be conducted carefully, communicated honestly, and designed to protect the interests of the people who relied on the original. The moment the promise was made remains meaningful. The commitment does not become retroactively illegitimate because it is being revised. The original intention, to whatever care, service, or relationship it represented, can survive a change in the specific terms through which it is expressed. This possibility is harder to see when the original words have become, in the mind of the person who spoke them, a permanent and non-negotiable command. Releasing that command's hold does not erase the past. It allows the present to be managed accurately. Someone who has relied on the arrangement being revised is now experiencing its absence or reduction. Their plans have been disrupted. A coverage gap exists that they expected to be filled. A schedule has changed that was built around an assumption of continuity. A support structure that was treated as permanent now requires replacement or modification. The disruption is genuine. The experience of inconvenience is real, and the frustration it produces is understandable and valid. The disruption deserves acknowledgement. The transition creates real difficulty, and pretending otherwise would be its own form of dishonesty. Practical disruption of this kind should be taken seriously in the design of any responsible transition. It is one of the primary reasons the revision process requires advance notice, thoughtful communication, and, where possible, a bridge between the old arrangement and the new one. Real inconvenience creates a real responsibility to minimize preventable disruption and support the people affected through the adjustment period. Emotional disappointment compounds the practical disruption. A person who had experienced a reliable relationship as a form of security may feel something beyond practical inconvenience when that relationship changes. They may experience the change as a kind of abandonment, a withdrawal of something they understood to be unconditional. This emotional response can be heard, can be given time, and can be acknowledged as arising from something real, the genuine disruption of a meaningful arrangement. Acknowledging it does not require conceding that the revision was wrong. It requires recognizing that real attachments can produce real grief when they change form. Practical disruption and emotional disappointment are both real responses to change. Neither constitutes proof that the change was a moral failure. The person responsible for a changed arrangement may have caused genuine inconvenience, and the inconvenience may be serious. What it does not automatically prove is that the change itself was an act of wrongdoing, that the person changing was in the wrong to have examined the commitment, found grounds for revision, and communicated the change. These are different questions. The question of whether the inconvenience was preventable is separate from the question of whether the revision was legitimate. The transition owed in any specific case should be calculated against the actual disruption. What practical support is needed, what information must be transferred, what time is required for adjustment, and what formal obligations, if any, govern the process. This is a bounded question. Some disruption cannot be eliminated. The arrangement is changing, and some adjustment is inherent. A portion of the discomfort the other person experiences is not the obligation of the person making the change to absorb, extend through self-sacrifice, or prevent through indefinite continuation. The demand to remain unchanged in order to prevent another person's reaction is a different category of claim from the legitimate request for adequate notice or responsible transition. When the argument for maintaining a commitment rests primarily on the other party's expressed or anticipated displeasure, rather than on the merits of the commitment itself, the available capacity, or the genuine dependencies involved, it has shifted from a claim about duty to a claim about control. Distinguishing between the two requires the same audit the reliability testament provides for every commitment. What exactly is being asked, who genuinely depends on what, and what is owed in the form of transition versus what is being demanded in the form of permanent compliance. Inconvenience is real, accusation is different. The framework now in view allows these to be separated with some clarity, and that clarity is necessary before the harder question can be answered honestly. Are there commitments that should not be revised? Chapter 6. When reliability should remain firm. There is a category of commitment whose distinguishing feature is not primarily about the person holding it. It is about what happens to other people when it changes. Dependent care, for children, for aging parents, for family members with health conditions or disabilities that make them genuinely reliant on consistent support, falls into this category. So do safety-critical professional roles, where an interruption in service creates direct risk to others. Legal obligations enforced by a court, a contract, or a professional licensing body have formal authority that personal preference and the conclusions of a private audit cannot simply override. These commitments carry weight that is external to the identity concerns examined elsewhere in this book, and they require a different analysis. Abrupt withdrawal from a commitment with genuine dependent implications is not a form of principled revision. It is the transfer of costs that were previously absorbed by the person leaving, onto people who may not be positioned to absorb them, and who did not choose the arrangement that is now being changed. A person who is genuinely indispensable to a dependent's safety or welfare does not become less indispensable by deciding they are finished. The dependency is a condition of the situation, not a condition of the person's willingness to acknowledge it. Before a change in this domain can proceed, the dependency must be accommodated through other means, through alternative support, through transition to qualified services, through the involvement of other capable parties. The useful distinction is between the permanent duty and the current implementation of it. A parent's responsibility for a child's welfare does not end because the parent finds the specific form of their current caregiving arrangement unsustainable. The permanent duty can survive a change in the implementation, a different schedule, a different division of responsibilities, additional support, modified participation, while remaining in force. The audit question in this domain is not should I stop, but how can the genuine obligation be fulfilled under present conditions, and what changes to its current form are compatible with protecting those who depend on it. Support, delegation, and the involvement of qualified services are not failures of commitment. They are tools for maintaining the substance of a commitment whose current form has become unsustainable. A caregiver who remains the responsible party but incorporates professional support has not abandoned their obligation. They have recognized that the obligation is best fulfilled by drawing on more resources than they alone can provide. A professional who transfers specific duties to a qualified colleague while remaining responsible for oversight has not defaulted on their commitment. They have restructured its implementation. The duty and the implementation are separate things. Emergency continuity, the provision of basic care and safety during any transition period, is not negotiable while the formal handover is occurring. When a commitment with genuine dependent implications is being restructured, the structuring of the transition must protect against gaps in coverage that would leave dependents exposed. This is a specific practical requirement, and it belongs in the transition plan before the change is communicated, not as an afterthought once the difficulty of the gap becomes apparent. Where the commitment involves legal, financial, or professional obligations, formal counsel is not optional. The reliability testament can help clarify what you are examining and why revision may be legitimate. It cannot substitute for the legal or professional advice that governs what is formally permissible and what procedure must be followed. Seeking qualified guidance before proceeding with changes to formally structured obligations is not an abdication of autonomy, it is the exercise of it, applied to the appropriate domain. Standards for transition in these high-stakes contexts are more demanding than in commitments without dependent implications. Adequate notice is longer. Documentation is more important. The involvement of alternative support is required before withdrawal, not after. And the definition of what constitutes adequate transition is not primarily determined by what is convenient for the person making the change. It is determined by what the people affected actually need to sustain their welfare during the period of adjustment. Not every sustained burden represents a commitment that has structurally expired. Some commitments are designed to be demanding, precisely because the circumstances requiring them are themselves demanding. And the difficulty is a feature of the situation rather than evidence that the commitment should be revised. A parent navigating a child's health crisis is not in a permanent arrangement that has revealed its true nature. A professional carrying an institution through a restructuring period has not discovered that the institution is wrong for them. Our caregiver supporting a parent through the final stages of a terminal illness is not in a situation that calls for an audit leading to withdrawal. These are difficult seasons, bounded in time, defined in purpose, creating genuine strain, and they require endurance rather than exit. The defining characteristics of a difficult season are worth identifying specifically. A difficult season has an endpoint or a clear review point, even if that point is not precisely known. It has a purpose that the person in it can still articulate in present terms. It has some form of support structure, either already in place or available to be built, even if accessing it requires deliberate effort. And it has a trajectory. The conditions are either stable or improving, even if slowly rather than progressively worse with no floor in sight. When these characteristics are present, the situation calls for differentiated assessment rather than either uncritical endurance or premature exit. Identifying the expected endpoint or review point matters because it transforms the experience from indefinite burden to bounded commitment. A difficult season without a defined end is not a difficult season. It is either a permanent condition that requires different design or a situation that has been allowed to drift past its appropriate conclusion without formal review. The review point is not necessarily a natural conclusion. It may be a scheduled reassessment. In 6 months, we will evaluate whether the current arrangement is still appropriate. Naming this point explicitly, for both the person in the commitment and the people depending on it, creates accountability for the review rather than allowing the arrangement to drift indefinitely under the assumption of permanence. Assessing available support is part of the honest evaluation. A difficult season endured without any additional resources is harder than it needs to be and more likely to produce the sustained deterioration that would eventually justify a different conclusion. A caregiver who has not investigated available professional support, a project leader who has not requested additional resources, a family member who has not had a direct conversation about the temporary and extraordinary nature of the current demands. These people are carrying more than the commitment requires because the commitment is being implemented without the infrastructure that would make it sustainable. Finding and integrating available support is not weakness. It is the application of the same problem-solving capacity that made the person reliable in the first place. The distinction between sacrifice and indefinite self-erasure applies with particular force in this context. Sacrifice is the acceptance of a defined cost in service of a defined purpose for a defined period. Self-erasure is the ongoing absorption of demands without acknowledged end, without recognized boundary, and without the expectation of eventual restoration. A caregiver who understands themselves to be in a temporary and demanding season, actively working to secure additional support and reviewing the arrangement's conditions at regular intervals, is practicing sacrifice. A caregiver who has stopped distinguishing between the demands of the season and the permanent content of their life may be practicing self-erasure, not because the commitment is wrong, but because it has been allowed to expand without examination. A project transition, a family adjustment, a period of professional intensity defined by a major deliverable, each of these has a natural completion point or a defined review horizon. The honest question during a difficult season is not whether the season is difficult. It is whether the structure supporting the season is also developing, whether the conditions are evolving in a direction that makes the eventual return of sustainable commitment possible, or whether the extraordinary has become the permanent through the simple absence of any examination. When the conditions are not improving, when review points have been passed without assessment, when the burden continues to accumulate without redistribution and without end in sight, the situation has moved from a difficult season into a different category entirely, one that the audit is designed to examine rather than automatically accept. Difficulty is not itself evidence that a commitment has exceeded its useful life. The honest evaluation of what kind of difficulty is present and what its trajectory looks like is what distinguishes informed endurance from unexamined continuation. There is a commitment whose examination produces a different result from the one examined above. The conditions have changed somewhat, but not materially. The difficulty is genuine but sustainable. The purpose is still articulable in present terms, not because it was articulated in the past and retained as inherited obligation, but because the person examining it now, with clear sight of its costs and its alternatives, would choose it again. This is chosen constancy, reliability that is renewed by present reasons rather than maintained by historical momentum. The cost of this commitment is known rather than concealed. The person holding it is not performing a level of investment that exceeds their honest capacity in order to maintain a record. They are delivering what the commitment genuinely requires, and they are doing so with an accurate understanding of what that requires from them. The cost is weighed against what the commitment produces, in the relationship, in the work, in the values it expresses, and the weighing arrives at continued consent rather than grudging continuation. Consent under known conditions, with a clear understanding of the alternatives, is a different posture from compliance through inertia. Capacity has been assessed honestly, and the commitment fits within it. The support available for fulfilling the commitment is adequate, or the person holding it is actively developing additional support rather than waiting for the burden to become unmanageable. There is a review practice, not necessarily formal but deliberate. A recurring examination of whether the commitment continues to make sense under present conditions, whether the terms are accurate, whether the person remains genuinely capable of delivering what they have promised. This practice distinguishes a living commitment from a fixed artifact. The structure of the commitment responds to honest feedback. A long partnership in which concerns are raised and heard, accommodated where possible and acknowledged where not, is different from one in which concerns are raised and dismissed or tolerated without ever being addressed. A craft or vocation pursued in a way that incorporates what the practitioner learns about their own limits, and development is different from one maintained rigidly against evidence that the practice requires revision. A service role that evolves as the server's understanding of what genuine service requires grows more complete is different from one frozen at the moment it was first accepted. The responsiveness of the structure to honest input is part of what makes continued reliability a choice rather than a constraint. Chosen constancy should not be confused with fear-based sameness. Though the external behavior looks identical, both produce continuity. The difference is in the relationship between the person and the commitment, whether the person is governing the commitment through ongoing choice or being governed by it through accumulated obligation. A reliable account of the distinction is available in the present tense. I am committed to this because, examining it today with full knowledge of what it requires, I continue to believe it serves what I genuinely value. If that sentence can be completed honestly, the constancy is chosen. If the sentence defaults to the past, I am committed to this because I have always been. The examination that the reliability testament requires has not yet been conducted. A long partnership, a sustained craft, a service role held through decades, each of these can be a genuine expression of chosen constancy, rather than an identity trap. The distinguishing feature is not the length of the commitment or the degree of difficulty it produces. It is whether the person holding it is doing so with full, current, and honest consent, or whether the commitment has become the floor of a room they have forgotten they could leave. Knowing that the door exists and choosing to remain inside are very different experiences, even when the room looks the same from the outside. That distinction between a commitment retained through choice and one maintained through the belief that no other option is available marks the line between identity and captivity. Having established where that line falls, and having examined the categories of change that are blocked, the changes that are legitimate, and the commitments that should remain in force, the reliability testament can move from diagnosis to process. The audit begins here. Chapter 7. The Reliability Audit. Before any classification or decision can be made, the commitment itself must be articulated without the identity language that has accumulated around it. Not, I am the person who handles this, or I have always been the one who makes sure this gets done, but what specifically was agreed? To whom? Under what conditions? For what purpose? In what form? The testament's process begins with a factual description, one sentence, or at most two, that captures the actual promise rather than the role it eventually became. The decorative language of identity can be set aside for this part of the process. The function being examined is what was actually committed to, which is a more manageable thing to assess than the character of the person who made the commitment. With the commitment stated plainly, the next entry in the audit is the original conditions. What was true at the time the promise was made that made it reasonable? The financial situation, the family structure, the professional context, the relationship stage, the available capacity, the purpose the commitment was designed to serve. These conditions do not need to be exhaustively catalogued. The relevant ones are those that have materially changed, which is why they must first be identified. A condition that was present and is still present does not bear on the question of revision. A condition that was present and is no longer provides the basis for the comparison. Present conditions are entered alongside the original ones. What is true now about the financial situation, the family structure, the professional context, the relationship stage, the available capacity and the purpose the commitment still does or no longer serves? The gap between these two columns is not itself the conclusion. It is the information on which the conclusion is based. A small gap may not justify revision. A large and material gap, in which the present conditions bear little resemblance to those under which the commitment was formed, provides the substantive basis for examining whether the original terms remain appropriate. The beneficiary of the commitment is identified specifically. Not everyone who depends on me, but the specific person or people or institution that the commitment was made to, whose practical interests are directly affected by the arrangement's continuation or change. This specificity matters because the obligations owed during transition are shaped by who specifically depends on what. A commitment whose primary beneficiary is a direct dependent with limited alternatives requires a different transition design from one whose primary beneficiary is a professional institution with multiple resources available. The consequence of change is estimated honestly. What specifically would be affected, and how significantly, if the commitment were revised? Not the imagined global consequence, every relationship reconsidered, every past action reinterpreted, but the actual practical effect on the specific beneficiary. Some changes create significant disruption that requires substantial transition planning. Others create inconvenience that the affected party can absorb without prolonged difficulty. The honest assessment of actual consequence shapes the design of the responsible revision, and it often reveals that the anticipated disruption was larger in imagination than it is in practice. With the commitment stated plainly and its conditions compared, the next step is identifying the forces that are maintaining it. These are not always the same as the reasons the commitment was originally made, and the gap between them is often where the most relevant information is found. 4 categories appear in most cases, and they carry different moral weights. The first is explicit promise, a specific stated commitment made to a specific person under conditions you were aware of at the time. This is the most straightforwardly legitimate source of obligation and the one most directly governed by the changed conditions analysis. Where an explicit promise was made and the conditions supporting it have not materially changed, the obligation remains strong. Where an explicit promise was made under conditions that have materially changed, the basis for revision exists and the process of honest amendment applies. The second is present duty, an ongoing responsibility arising from the current situation, the actual needs of an actual person or institution at this moment, regardless of whether a formal promise was ever made about it. Present duty is often more morally immediate than historical promise, because it is grounded in what is actually needed now, rather than in what was anticipated earlier. A parent whose child currently needs consistent presence is bound by present duty, even if no formal promise ever addressed this specific moment. Present duty should be identified separately from historical promise, because the response it requires may be different from the response to a formal commitment. Reputation concern is the third category. The desire to protect how others perceive the reliability record, independent of whether the commitment currently serves anyone's genuine needs. Reputation concern is not irrelevant. How others assess your reliability affects your ability to function in relationships and institutions, but it is the most susceptible to distortion and most likely to maintain commitments past their useful life. A commitment maintained primarily because revision would require explaining yourself is a commitment maintained by reputation management rather than by genuine duty. Fear of disappointment is the fourth category. The anticipation of another person's emotional response and the desire to prevent it, regardless of whether that prevention corresponds to what is actually owed. This is the force most likely to be indistinguishable from genuine care and most likely to masquerade as moral obligation. The test is available. If nobody could express disappointment, if the decision and its effects were entirely private, would the commitment still be maintained? If the commitment would end without the anticipated emotional consequence to prevent, its current basis is primarily the avoidance of another person's feeling rather than the fulfillment of genuine duty. A fifth element deserves consideration: the personal benefit of remaining indispensable. This has been examined in the infrastructure section, but it belongs in the audit as well. If continued reliability provides belonging, status, control, or security that would be threatened by revision, that benefit belongs in the analysis. Not because it is shameful, but because decisions made primarily to protect personal benefit are different in character from decisions made to honor genuine duty. Having identified each category present in the specific commitment, the final step in this section is weighting them. What proportion of the continuing force behind this commitment comes from genuine duty, from explicit promise, from reputation management, and from the avoidance of disappointment? The answer shapes the appropriate response. 4 responses are available, and they are not ranked by moral courage. The appropriate one is determined by the audit, not by whether it requires the most difficult conversation. Maintain is the appropriate response when the present reasons for the commitment are sound, when the original conditions have not materially changed, when present duty genuinely requires continuation, when the commitment remains within honest capacity, and when the person examining it now would choose it again. Maintaining a commitment after the audit has confirmed its grounds is not passivity. It is the active selection of continuation based on current evidence, which is a different relationship to the commitment than continuing because examination was never attempted. Amend is appropriate when the commitment's underlying purpose remains valid, but its current scope, timing, form, or terms no longer correspond to reality. The amended commitment is still a commitment to the same underlying relationship or responsibility, but in a form that accurately describes what can currently be delivered. Amending requires communicating the change clearly, explaining what is changing and what remains, and giving affected parties sufficient time to adjust. An amendment is not a withdrawal. It is a correction. Transition is appropriate when responsibility must move, gradually, responsibly, and with adequate preparation, from the current holder to another person, institution, or arrangement. Transition is the appropriate response when the commitment has genuine dependent implications that cannot be abandoned abruptly, when a successor needs time to be identified and prepared, and when the practical effects of transfer require management over a defined period. A transition has a design, a timeline, and a clear endpoint. It is not indefinite continuation under a different name. End is the appropriate response when the commitment no longer has valid present grounds, when the original conditions have changed so materially that the original purpose no longer applies, when continued performance requires sustained dishonesty about capacity or values, and when no amended form would correspond to what can honestly be delivered. Ending a commitment with appropriate notice, honest communication, and provision for affected parties is not a failure of reliability. It is the honest conclusion of a process that has revealed that the commitment's grounds are gone. Across all 4 responses, stakeholder safeguards belong in the plan before the communication, not as a supplement provided in response to expressed concern. Identifying specifically who will be affected, what they need, and how the transition will be supported is part of designing the response, not an afterthought to it. Consider, in whatever form feels honest, one commitment you currently hold whose conditions have materially changed, but whose wording has never been examined against those changes. Not for public disclosure, this is a private record, but for your own clarity. The testament works only when the entry is accurate. Chapter 8. Change without betrayal. The communication of a changed commitment requires a different discipline from its internal examination. The internal audit is for clarity. The communication is for honesty. And honesty in this context means being specific rather than comprehensive, direct rather than exhaustive, and accurate without being accusatory. The old commitment should be named as it was understood, what was promised, what it produced, and what it meant to the person receiving it. Naming it accurately, without minimizing its previous importance, is the first element of a communication that preserves trust rather than eroding it. The material change that justifies the revision should be named with equal specificity, not a general account of having changed as a person or a vague reference to different priorities. but the actual altered condition, the financial situation that shifted, the health circumstance that developed, the capacity that genuinely changed, the values that, through sustained experience, revealed a different hierarchy. Named specifically, the change gives the other person the information they need to understand the revision as a response to facts rather than as a withdrawal of care. Vagueness in this context reads as evasion rather than discretion. The revised conclusion follows what the commitment looks like going forward, stated as clearly as the original commitment was. This is not necessarily a lesser promise. It may be a differently shaped one that accurately corresponds to what is available now rather than what was available when the original was made. Stating the revised commitment specifically, rather than simply announcing what is ending, gives the communication direction rather than only loss. The person receiving it understands both what has changed and what remains. Accountability for the previous arrangement is preserved rather than disclaimed. If the original commitment was maintained longer than the honest capacity supported it, the communication should acknowledge that, not as a confession requiring extensive processing, but as part of the honest account of what happened. If decisions made under the original arrangement created effects that a more accurate commitment would not have produced, those effects deserve acknowledgement where that acknowledgement is meaningful. The goal is not self-punishment. It is honesty that allows the other person to trust that the current account is more accurate than the previous one. The explanation should not include invented attribution. Framing the revision as a response to the other person's behavior, when the actual basis is changed conditions, capacity, or values, is a form of dishonesty that compounds the disruption with accusation. The change should be grounded in the facts that actually produced it, which keeps the communication clean and keeps the relationship, wherever possible, intact. Constructing blame where the honest account does not require it creates damage that the transition will then need to repair. What remains reliable should be stated explicitly. The change in a specific commitment does not necessarily signal the end of a relationship, a role, or a connection. Naming what continues, what form of reliability is still available, what is not being revised, what the person can still count on, provides the context that prevents the specific revision from being read as a general withdrawal. The territory of what remains is as important a part of the communication as the territory of what is changing. Identifying specifically who is affected by the change is the first practical step in transition planning. Not everyone in the general orbit of the commitment, but the people whose daily arrangements, their planning, their care, or their professional operations directly depend on what is changing. This specificity determines both the content and the timeline of the transition process. A commitment with one primary beneficiary requires a different design from one that distributes its effects across multiple people or an institutional system. Notice should be calibrated to the degree of practical disruption. Some changes can be communicated and implemented within a short time because the disruption they create is limited and the affected party has adequate alternatives. Others require extended lead time because the systems depending on them are complex. Alternatives must be developed, and the practical adjustment will take time that cannot be shortened without genuine harm. The question is not what amount of notice feels comfortable for the person making the change. It is what amount of notice gives the affected people the real opportunity to adapt. These are often different answers. Transferring information and responsibility before the transition is complete prevents the loss of institutional knowledge, relationship context, and practical understanding that makes the gap more damaging than the change itself. A professional who departs a role without transferring their understanding of a client's history has not completed a responsible transition. They have completed a departure. The information that exists only in one person's memory is an obligation to transfer, not a property to retain. Where the commitment involved managing information, relationships, or institutional knowledge, the transfer of these is as much a part of the transition as the announcement of the change. Backups are built before they are needed, rather than recommended for development afterward. If the commitment's revision creates a gap where a critical function was previously covered, identifying who will cover it and ensuring they are prepared to do so is the work of transition rather than the work of aftermath. The reliable person who builds an alternative before stepping back has fulfilled a different and more complete version of the original commitment than the one who simply announces the change. Dependence and essential operations require specific protection during the transition period. Whatever minimum level of continuity is required to prevent genuine harm to people who are genuinely vulnerable must be maintained until that minimum can be reliably provided through other means. This is not a concession to the original arrangement's permanence. It is the application of the same responsible attention that characterized the original commitment, now applied to the process of ending or amending it. A firm transition endpoint belongs in the plan. An open-ended transition is not a transition. It is a delay of the change, combined with the ambiguity of neither the old arrangement nor the new one being in full effect. Naming a specific date or condition at which the transition will be complete creates accountability for its completion and prevents the gradual reversion to the original arrangement that an unresolved transition tends to produce. The endpoint may be adjusted if circumstances genuinely require it, but it should be named, agreed, and held. Some people will express disappointment. Some will say directly or communicate through their behavior that the change represents something about you that they find difficult to accept. This response should receive genuine attention before it receives a response. Among the disappointment and criticism, there may be accurate information, a piece of the transition that was poorly handled, a consequence that was not adequately accounted for, an aspect of the change whose effects were more significant than the assessment recognized. Valid feedback of this kind is useful and worth incorporating into the repair. Where the criticism identifies a specific and careless aspect of how the change was implemented, repairing it is the honest response. An unnecessarily abrupt communication, an inadequate transition plan, a stakeholder whose needs were not adequately considered. These are things that can be acknowledged and corrected without retracting the underlying decision that the audit produced. The revision may have been legitimate, and its implementation may have been imperfect. These are not the same thing, and addressing the imperfection does not require undoing the revision. What should not receive the same treatment as valid feedback is the global character sentence, the claim that one revision has revealed something permanently disqualifying about who you are. That sentence is worth hearing once, worth assessing against the evidence of the entire record, and worth setting down afterward. A relationship that extends trust only when every commitment remains static has not extended trust in any meaningful sense. It has extended compliance requirements. The distinction between someone who is genuinely trustworthy and someone who is merely unchanging is the distinction this entire book has been examining. The preference for the previous arrangement is also worth acknowledging without conceding to it as a verdict. Some people genuinely preferred the former version of the commitment because it served them better. That preference is understandable. It is not by itself evidence that the former arrangement was more legitimate than the current one. Adults live in arrangements that sometimes change, and the change is not always an improvement from every perspective simultaneously. Being the person whose change disappointed another person is a cost of principled revision, and it cannot be avoided by sufficient care in communication. Future conduct is the appropriate arena for establishing what the revised reputation corresponds to. The revision communicated, the transition executed, the available repair performed. After those things are done, the new record of what can be counted on begins to be written through behavior rather than through argument. A person who delivers accurately on a revised, honestly scoped commitment builds a more durable basis for trust than one who maintains the appearance of an original commitment they can no longer honestly fulfill. Trust follows observable conduct over time. It cannot be secured in advance through explanation alone. The old title carries the years it earned. As it fades from active function, what follows is not a blank record, but one that begins where the amended testament does, at the point where the commitment was revised to correspond to what is actually true. The next question is what that correspondence, maintained consistently across future commitments, eventually becomes. Final chapter: reliability that can move. The behavior most likely to prevent a future reliability audit from being necessary begins at the moment of agreement rather than at the moment of revision. Examining capacity before committing is not a defensive maneuver against relationship or obligation. It is the first act of genuine reliability, the willingness to assess what is actually available before attaching a promise to it. The assessment does not need to be elaborate. It requires a realistic estimate of what the commitment will take, a comparison with what is currently available, and an honest determination of whether the arithmetic produces a deliverable result. That sequence, performed before agreement rather than discovered after it, changes the character of the commitment from the start. Defining scope produces a more honest commitment than one whose terms are deliberately left broad to signal generosity. A promise to be available for a specific purpose, during a specific time frame in a specific form, is more reliable than a promise to always be there. Not because the narrower version is less caring, but because it can actually be delivered as stated. The broad promise implies unlimited availability, which no person actually has, and it sets up the gap between stated and actual commitment that the previous sections of this book have been examining. The scope of a commitment should correspond to what can genuinely be promised, even if that is less than the largest version of what could theoretically be offered. Timing and review conditions belong in the commitment at the outset. Not every commitment requires a formal review date. Many natural commitments operate within contexts that make ongoing reassessment implicit. But where a commitment is being made across a significant period, or in a domain where conditions are likely to change, building in a specific review creates the expectation of honest examination rather than the expectation of permanent continuation. I will take this on for the next 6 months, and we'll assess at that point is a more honest and more reliable statement than I'll take this on with no acknowledgement that circumstances may require examination. The prestige promise, the commitment whose primary purpose is to demonstrate a certain kind of person rather than to deliver a specific thing, is the most dangerous category because it is most likely to be made from identity rather than from genuine assessment. Agreeing to a role, a responsibility, or a relationship level because it signals something about who you are inverts the proper order of commitment. The agreement should follow from the assessment. The identity should follow from the agreement. The reputation should follow from consistent delivery. When any of these steps is skipped, when the agreement jumps directly to the identity claim without passing through honest assessment, the resulting commitment is fragile by design. Early communication when conditions change, rather than at the point of visible failure, is the practice that makes the new model of reliability distinguishable from the old one. The reliable person in this framework is not one who never encounters difficulty or changed conditions. They are one who communicates the change before it affects performance. This practice requires monitoring the current state of a commitment with the same attention given to its initial design, and it requires the willingness to report what the monitoring reveals, even when the report creates inconvenience or requires explanation. The capacity to monitor a commitment's current conditions honestly is not a passive property. It requires deliberate attention directed at the gap between what is being promised and what is currently being delivered, and at the signals that indicate that gap may be opening. Those signals may be as concrete as consistent overruns of available time or energy, or as subtle as a recurring reluctance that was not previously present. Both categories are worth registering rather than normalizing. Normalizing the signal, treating the recurring indicator as simply the cost of the commitment, rather than as information about its current sustainability, is the habit that produces the delayed disclosure pattern examined earlier in this book. Identifying a meaningful change early enough for it to be addressed before it affects output is a significantly different experience from identifying it at the point of failure. Early identification preserves options. The commitment can be examined and redesigned, additional support can be sought, the affected party can be given genuine time to adjust. A change communicated early produces a negotiation. A change revealed at the point of visible failure produces a crisis whose management is constrained by the urgency that the earlier disclosure would have prevented. Early communication is, in a practical sense, a more effective form of reliability than maintained performance followed by abrupt collapse. The offer of options where they exist transforms the communication of a changed commitment from a statement of limitation into an act of problem-solving. I can no longer deliver what was originally agreed, and here are the alternatives I have considered places the communication in the register of responsible management rather than simple withdrawal. The alternatives may not be what the other party would have chosen. They may not be as convenient, as comprehensive, or as immediate as the original arrangement, but their presence demonstrates that the change has been managed rather than simply announced. Not every situation offers genuine alternatives, and overclaiming availability here creates its own problem. But where options genuinely exist, presenting them is part of the responsible revision. Documentation of agreements, where the context makes it appropriate, creates a shared record that benefits both parties and reduces the ambiguity that revised commitments can produce. This does not mean formal contract language in informal relationships. It means that where an arrangement is being amended, the terms of the amendment are written down, shared and agreed, so that the amended version becomes the explicit reference point rather than existing only in the differing memories of each party. A documented amendment is more reliable than a verbal understanding that each party may recall differently at a later point. The identity beyond consistency, the understanding of the self that does not rest on an unbroken record of unchanged commitments, is what makes this kind of practice sustainable rather than threatening. A reliable person who revises commitments when evidence genuinely requires it, communicates changes before they produce failure, offers options where they exist, and documents the resulting agreements, has a more accurate account of their own reliability than one whose self-understanding depends on never having changed anything. The record is not shorter. It is more honest, and honesty is the specific quality on which meaningful reliability rests. Reliability, in the form the Reliability Testament has been developing across its chapters, is not an unchanging quality. It is a relationship between what is said and what is true, between what is promised and what is delivered, between the person you present yourself to be and the person who is actually governing your choices. An honest relationship between these pairs requires that all of them remain accurate simultaneously. When conditions change and the promise does not, the relationship between word and truth has broken down. When capacity changes and the commitment does not, the relationship between promise and delivery has broken down. Restoring those relationships through honest revision is not a departure from reliability. It is its active maintenance. Long-term commitment retains its value in this framework. Nothing in the Reliability Testament argues against the decision to remain reliably present across many years in a relationship, a craft, a vocation, or a service role. The argument is for the quality of the commitment rather than its duration. That a long-term commitment should be one whose terms are accurate, whose continuation is chosen rather than assumed, and whose form remains responsive to the honest evidence of what sustaining it actually requires. Duration is a consequence of renewal, not a substitute for it. Capacity to update, to examine the record, to name what has changed, to revise the terms when revision is warranted, and to communicate the revision before it produces failure, is what prevents the pattern described in the earliest chapters of this book from reconstituting itself. The private oath rewritten and enforced without examination, the infrastructure built around assumed permanence, the morally loaded resistance to any visible change, these reassemble gradually when the practice of honest examination is absent. Maintaining the capacity to revise is not a single decision. It is a recurring practice applied to the commitments that structure a life. Disappointment is a consequence that the revised, reliable person accepts rather than eliminates. Not every person affected by a changed commitment will receive the change well. Even when the communication is honest, the transition is thoughtful, and the underlying revision is legitimate. Some disappointments are not resolvable through better communication or more careful planning. They are the honest cost of a more accurate version of the self becoming visible to people who had organized their expectations around the previous one. Accepting this cost is part of the integrity of the revision process, and refusing to accept it, managing every possible expression of disappointment away through continued compliance, is the mechanism that produced the original trap. Preventable harm is repaired where the means and the genuine obligation to do so exist. Careless implementation of a legitimate revision creates damage that is not inevitable. It is the result of how the change was handled rather than the fact that it occurred. The distinction is worth preserving carefully. The revision may have been right, and its implementation may have been improvable, and the improvable parts deserve repair. But repair is bounded. It addresses specific identifiable effects of specific identifiable failures in the transition process. It does not extend indefinitely to absorb every negative consequence experienced by every person who preferred the old arrangement. Reputation follows evidence. Not the evidence of an idealized self or a defensive argument, but the observable record of what commitments were honored, what changes were communicated, and when, how transitions were managed, and whether the resulting promises were delivered as stated. This record builds itself through conduct rather than through claims, and it takes time, the same time that the original record required, assembled through the same mechanism of repeated observable behavior. The reputation eventually reflects the person, not the version of the person frozen at the moment of an earlier identity. The promise at the beginning of this book, made at the moment the letter sat half-finished, and the strongest obstacle was the sentence, "I am the one who never changes," was about returning to that person with something more useful than encouragement. The testament now contains the tools for addressing that moment with precision, a process for examining what exactly was promised, what has changed in the conditions supporting it, what forces are maintaining it, what response the audit recommends, how the response should be communicated, and what the reliable person looks like on the other side of that communication. Epilogue. The amended testament. Return to the letter that was never finished, the commitment that has been sitting in the gap between what was promised and what is currently true. The audit has been conducted. The commitment has been stated plainly, its original conditions identified and compared with present ones, its beneficiary named, its forces categorized and weighted. The result of that process is one of 4 responses. Perhaps maintain, because the present reasons remain sound, the capacity is genuine, and the commitment, examined with full attention, is still one the person would choose. Perhaps amend, because the underlying purpose remains valid, but its current scope, timing, or form no longer corresponds to what can honestly be delivered. Perhaps transition, because the responsibility belongs, through a designed and supported process, with someone more adequately positioned to hold it. Perhaps end, because the conditions supporting the original commitment have changed so materially that no amended version would be honest. Whichever response the audit produces, it is communicated before the failure it would otherwise generate. The letter is finished and delivered. The conversation is initiated rather than deferred. The material change is named specifically, the revised commitment stated clearly. The transition plan described in enough detail for the affected person to assess what it means for them. The communication is not a defense of the person's character or a comprehensive accounting of every prior commitment. It is an honest account of what is changing, why it is changing, and what remains. Brief, specific, and early is more reliable than comprehensive, defensive, and delayed. The choice, communicated with notice and carried out with the care appropriate to its specific stakes, is now part of the record, not as an exception to reliability, but as an expression of it. A testament that shows visible, dated, explained amendments is a more accurate document than one whose surface has remained unchanged, while the reality it described quietly ceased to correspond. The seal that once appeared to guarantee permanence has been replaced by something that operates differently, a mechanism that can rotate when the evidence requires it, that can be reviewed by either party, and that accurately represents the current terms of the commitment rather than its original ones. Reliability, correctly understood, is truthful commitment under real conditions. It is the alignment between what is stated and what is actually available to be delivered. An alignment maintained not through fixed terms, but through honest, ongoing correspondence between the promise and the present. A commitment that was made honestly and is currently being fulfilled honestly is reliable. A commitment whose terms no longer correspond to what is actually happening, maintained only through concealment of the gap, is not reliable in any meaningful sense. It is consistent, which is a different and lesser quality. Revision is responsible conduct when the evidence, the capacity, or the duty genuinely changes. When conditions have shifted materially, when new information has altered what the commitment actually requires, when values have matured to reveal a different priority than the one that governed the original agreement. The person who revises a commitment under these conditions, with adequate notice, honest communication, and genuine provision for the people affected, is practicing reliability at a more complete level than the one who maintains the appearance of the original arrangement while its reality quietly deteriorates. The amended testament is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of continued honesty. There is a final question the testament asks, and it belongs to whoever is reading it now, rather than to the record of chapters already consulted. Which part of reliability has made change hardest for you? The reputation, the accumulated record of constancy that feels at risk the moment a single revision is communicated. The promise, the specific words spoken at a specific moment, whose authority over the present seems to exceed the authority of everything learned since. The usefulness, the belonging, the position, the security that comes from being genuinely needed, and the fear of what happens when the need is met by someone else. Or the fear of disappointment, the anticipation of another person's emotional response, which has been allowed to function as a prohibition even when the basis for the commitment has legitimately changed. The question is worth sitting with specifically, because the force most present in your case is the one the next examination will need to address most directly. What follows from this testament is a different but related volume. The Reliability Testament has examined what happens when a yes already given continues past the conditions that made it sound. The Reflex Register examines the moment before that yes is given, the instant when agreement occurs, before the self has been fully consulted, before the capacity has been assessed, before the implications have been considered. If the reliable person you have been reading about has been struggling to revise what was already promised, the Reflex Register asks where those promises were assembled in the first place and what it would mean to be present at the moment they form.